I think we should be more aware of it in our conversation and think about the work that it's doing each time. What are we actually asking when we ask whether we are normal or whether a certain thing is normal? We should very much think about, who does that leave out? Who is it that we're comparing ourselves to when we ask whether we're normal, and who are we excluding from this idea?
Hello and welcome to Idioms of Normality. I'm your host, Paul Mason. I love asking people the question, what is normal? And this is on Future Framed TV, the collective podcast series of Traces&Dreams. And I'm joined today by Sarah Chaney, who has just published her book, Am I Normal? Well, actually a year or two behind. I'm very much behind the 8 ball on this book, and I'm very ashamed that I've only just got her on the channel, and that's entirely my fault. She comes to us from the Centre of History of Emotions. Sarah, welcome.
Thanks very much.
Now tell us, before we launch in with the inevitable question, what is normal, what brought you to the topic of normality, and what perspectives and experiences do you bring to this subject?
I suppose there's two answers to that question. So one is when I kind of discovered the topic as a historian, and I remember during much of my research was on the history of psychiatry and mental health, and I came across this book called Histories of the Normal and Abnormal, which was edited by Waltraud Ernst, and the introduction to that just had a kind of like intriguing taster on the idea that normality itself had a history, that the very word normal wasn't in use to describe human beings until the 1830s, but that was kind of it. There was just a little introduction to this idea that I really wanted to understand and explore further. So some years passed, and then I thought, well, no one else seems to be taking it further, so maybe I should do that. And also because it's a question that had always seemed quite important to me personally, even though it was a question that I'd struggled with. So like through my teens and my 20s, I always worried about whether I was normal. I always thought I wasn't normal, but I never really thought about what it was that I was comparing myself to. So I always had this idea that, oh, if I could just be a bit more normal, then I'd fit in. If I could just do this, that, and the other, but I never could quite define what that thing was. So actually, then looking into the idea of, well, where does this idea come from? What is it that we're actually trying to compare ourselves to when we ask whether we're normal?
So it was an academic interest and a personal interest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Excellent.
Always nice when the two things collide.
Now, if I've learned anything from your book, it's that I'm asking the wrong question. But can I ask you the wrong question?
Absolutely.
Okay. What is normal?
Well, again, I think there's kind of two ways that I think about that. One is when we use the term today in everyday speech, and we mean all sorts of different things. So we might, when we ask if we're normal, we might be saying, am I healthy? Is that trait desirable? Is it ideal? Is it average? Is it kind of like other people? And we often, as I previously had done, don't really stop to think about which of those things we're actually asking and what we're wondering. And one thing that I found interesting when looking through the history of the term has always had this kind of confused complexity, and through the kind of in the mid and later 20th century, you get a lot of people saying, well, if people would just go back to the original meaning of the term normal, then everyone would understand it a bit better, and we wouldn't have all this complication in health and medicine particularly. But actually, right from the very beginning, the term had managed to mean both average and ideal at the same time, even though those are quite different concepts. So I guess asking what is normal raises all sorts of complications. So perhaps the better question to ask would be, where does this idea of normal come from?
Okay. That's cool because I'm going to get to that question. Where does the concept of normality come from? But if just let me just check in with you and make sure that I'm on the same page. It's a word that has loads of different meanings. It can mean something healthy, desirable. It can be descriptive and just talk about the average, but it can also be prescriptive in the sense that it's telling us something we should be, but we're not. And that kind of resonates with what you were saying a bit earlier as well, in terms of you always felt that you should be normal and that you felt that you weren't normal.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So it's often this pressure that either is placed on us by those around us or by social expectations, or sometimes we place it on ourselves. That's something that we feel like we ought to live up to, even if we can't quite describe what that thing is.
It's it's funny when I think about that in the context of where normal comes from, and you can tell us a lot more about where the concept of normality comes from. Where does it come from?
So it's kind of starts off as a mathematical term. So before normal, the word was applied to human beings. It was used in maths simply to describe a line or an angle. And it was a mathematician or statistician and astrologer who first astronomer, sorry, who first began to apply this to people. A Belgian statistician called Adolf Quetelet.
I just love that he's called Adolf. It's with all the harm that he's done with this concept, like it's quite violent.
Yeah, I mean there is a very violent history to the normal, not necessarily in Quetelet's work specifically, because what he was very interested in was collecting huge sets of data. So he was helped by the fact that at the same time censuses were beginning to be taken across a number of European and North American countries. People were interested in gathering all these sets of data, and so these statistics were there for Quetelet to analyze. And he'd come across this concept that had been known as the astronomer's error curve. And this was a statistical method that astronomers used to kind of judge whether their measurements that they were taking were correct. So when they were measuring a distance, say, they'd take loads and loads of different measurements of the distance of a star. And then these measurements would tend to fall on a bell-shaped curve. So most of the measurements they take would be near the center because they would be very close. They would have very small errors, and those down at the far sides, there'd be fewer of them that had much larger errors. So this shape that later became known as a normal distribution was originally known as the astronomer's error curve, because for the astronomer, all of the data they plotted on this chart, most of it was errors, and the very correct measurement was right at the center of this curve. That was the thing they were trying to measure.
If I can ask a question here, in the
Yeah,
bell
sure.
curve, there's that line that they put slap bang in the middle, and it's perpendicular to the x-axis. Is it that line that was used to call this the normal?
Well, in a normal distribution, all the averages align. So of course in maths you have different types of averages. You have the mean and the mode and the medium. And in a perfect normal distribution, all those things are the same. Um, Although many of the data sets that Quetelet used weren't necessarily perfect distributions. But what he discovered is that when he started using these statistics of, say, the heights of a large group of people, they would fall on this roughly this same curve. And because his background was in astronomy, he thought, well, the normal human being falls right at the center of this curve. And he came up with a concept of the average man to describe this person who he felt was right at the center of the curve.
And
And there's a, oh, sorry.
no, go on.
There's an interesting study in which he describes this by using a data set of the chest sizes of Scottish soldiers, and this was data that had been gathered elsewhere by a Scottish physician, and Quetelet apparently made several mistakes in actually copying the data anyway. He wasn't that painstaking with the data in which he used, but he felt that it was as if all these Scottish soldiers had been casts of the one statue, and he used the example of the Borghese gladiator as kind of the ideal male form. And then all these soldiers were slightly misshapen casts of this statue, and only the average man at the very center was exactly the same as the statue, and therefore was the perfect human being.
This is super interesting. And I mean, first of all, what I love about this is that you've found this book, Histories of the Normal and Abnormal, and it's piqued your interest. And rather than just like putting that down as a concept and go, oh, normal is got a history, it's a social construct and it's not real, rather than just putting that aside and brushing it off, you've stuck with it and you've gone, hang on, there is a history here and I'm going to go and look it up and find out. And then what you discover is there's this Belgian astronomer who misappropriates a mathematical method that's completely appropriate for the study of single moving planetary objects with fixed mass and size, but then applies it to populations of discrete individuals, each with their own developmental trajectory. And it looks mathematically and scientifically sophisticated, but actually what you're saying is that it's epistemologically flawed, because that Gaussian curve that you're talking about is all about averaging out people's guesses. Now, each human that's born is not a guess. It is a single living being with their own life history and biography and cultural experiences. And yet that all gets flattened out. And in fact, the Gaussian cutting off of the outliers because they are possibly the most incorrect guesses, but then applying that to humans and cutting off the outliers in human populations as though they are aberrances from the norm, and therefore we cut them out from the population because they'll skew our data, is a really problematic turn of events.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things that Quetelet assumed was that this idea applied to everything. So it wasn't just things that you could measure statistically, but every single thing. The average man was perfect in every way. He was a perfect moral man, and every kind of moral and intellectual faculty would also fall on this curve. So there would be people who were problematic outliers at either end, and the average man would be the perfect moral and intellectual being.
And it's important to note here, this is not a concept that existed beforehand.
No, it didn't.
This is and yet what I find fascinating about this is also that you're talking about these people who imagine that normal has always been with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one interesting way of thinking about it is that it's not that people didn't compare themselves to each other previously, and certainly they did, and people would be treated might be treated as an outcast for whatever reason in their town or in their village or in their community. But what this so-called science of the normal did is that it applied this overarching idea to all populations and all people, so that we would, rather than seeing ourselves simply in conjunction to the specific community that we're in, people had to kind of measure up globally, as it were, and yet the global norms that they created were based on a very specific subset of people.
And in the first instance, when you're talking about that subset of people, you're talking about data that is based on men, excludes women, and is serving the needs of men as well, excluding women. Tell us more about the gendered dimensions of this concept.
Certainly through the 19th century, all the pretty much all the scientists who looked at this this idea were male. They were also white, generally Western European or North American scientists, and from educated middle class backgrounds. And these were things that they didn't themselves interrogate. They just assumed that was the baseline, as it were. So men were the standard by which women should be judged. So all of the characteristics that they had kind of came to be seen as the normal standard.
What I found really powerful in your book about that is that you might think this is something that is relegated to the past. It's something that's deep 19th century history, and it's got nothing to do with us in the 21st century. But then you look at medical textbooks today, and 70%, 90% of the images are men. These statistical, we are living in the aftermath of this statistical construct. And on the front page of every statistics textbook in primary schools and secondary schools around the world, one of the first calculations people learn is the calculation of the average, with no understanding of the damage it does to populations when you create an image of the normal person that is based entirely off data from men and excludes women entirely. It's highly problematic, not just morally, because it's a form of discrimination, but also because when that's rolled out, it as a one size fits all, it doesn't recognize diversity at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one example that really brings this to life is that of the statue of Norma, the so-called average or typical American woman. And Norma and her counterpart Normman were created in about 1942 by sexologist Robert Dickinson and sculptor Abraham Belsky. And they took tens of thousands of measurements of American men and women. And actually, it was relatively unusual that they'd included women in this. A lot of the previous sets focused on the average man, whereas they looked at the average man and the average woman. But then the local newspaper ran a competition to try and find the real life Norma. So they published an application form where women had to circle their own measurements on just 9, I think it was, of the statue's characteristics. And they thought they'd find somebody who fitted Norma exactly. But in fact, most women didn't even come close to Norma. The competition organisers invited the 5% of women who came closest to Norma's measurements in to measure them again to make sure everything was being done accurately, in the hope that they would find this real Norma. And they eventually awarded the prize to one woman who came closest to Norma's measurements, but even she didn't meet Norma's measurements exactly. So what it turned out was, out of the nearly 4,000, I think it was, women who entered this competition, not a single one of them met Norma's measurements in real life. So while they'd created this this thing called the average woman that Quetelet would have seen as the ideal human being, in real life, she didn't actually exist.
Even when put to the test, they couldn't even find normality within a population.
Yeah, this was even though Norma was based on, as is generally the case with the normal, a very specific set of characteristics. So her measurements largely came from young white American women. So aged between about 18 and 25. So even though they had this very specific set of criteria, they still couldn't find a woman who met Norma's measurements exactly. And yet the idea of Norma as this normal or average or typical woman remained. And the assumption was that to be an American woman, you had to be like Norma. Whereas, well, you know, for those, even though it was impossible for anyone to measure up to Norma, it was easier for those who were also white women aged between 18 and 25 to fit the criteria of the statute.
So despite evidence to the contrary, the concept of normality still gained traction, and then white people like yourself and me still find ourselves today thinking of comparing ourselves to a completely fictional image of normality in our daily lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I find fascinating about that story as well, I mean, you're a historian, I'm an anthropologist, and so the historical case study that here is this scientific idea that finds no validation in empirical data, and yet the idea still gains cultural traction. But also at the same time, you're talking about 4,000 women who filled in an application form to subject themselves to measurement, ranking, and surveillance. And it indicates this cultural readiness to subject ourselves to these kinds of pursuits, which, I mean, even that's historically novel, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I've not really thought about it quite like that before, but I suppose if you go back further, that's also the case in Francis Galton, the scientist who coins the term eugenics. Did a lot of measuring of people in order to support his theories. And one thing that he did is set up an anthropometric laboratory at the International Health Exhibition. I think it was in 1884, around then. And that gave him a huge amount of data because people loved it. They came through and they paid a fee in order to measure everything about themselves using the machines that he'd got, and then they'd get a card with all of their data on it, and then he would also get their data for his own scientific purposes.
They're not just volunteering, they're paying for it. They're going, I'm
Yeah,
prepared
absolutely.
to pay you to measure me, to subject myself to your measurements. Fascinating. Sorry for
Yeah,
interrupting.
so I guess this science is really is also tapping into this interest that people have in about, and sometimes it is in this, oh, this is a new scientific thing. So people are coming to this exhibition saying, this is something I want to be a part of. I want to be a modern human who understands science and is part of something, but also I want to know how I measure up to other people.
And it's a concept that veils itself as objective and true and benign, and yet it 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 is this incredibly powerful boundary marker for who is included and who is excluded. And when I think about all these men that you're talking about in, elite clubs, whether it's research institutions, universities, research institutes, or otherwise, like I'm just imagining when while you're talking, I'm just imagining all these men sort of fascinated in something they don't actually have, this sense of normality, like, and that's me teasing them a little bit and trying to distance my own my own self from their interest in normality. I'm very much interested in deconstructing it and teasing it apart. But one thing we haven't really touched on is just how violent it is, and this comes through in the book also, in that these calculations which served white populations, whether it was in Europe, in Belgium, or in the US with Abramsky and Robert Dickinson statues, they were forwarding very racist, gendered, ableist, ageist ideas that over the course of time have also become very problematic for the very people that they were supposed to serve as well, because they have become an obstacle for your sense of inclusion, my sense of inclusion, just as much as, well, maybe not just as much, but in the first instance, the people who would have felt those patterns of inclusion, exclusion were people who were not aggregated into the data. You were saying that it was typically white American women who were captured in the data for Norma, the statue Norma, and that excluded people who didn't fit those categories, which is really harmful to then the suite of whether it's pharmaceutical products or tailored products that are put on market shelves that don't fit every single body. And I think people don't realize that they're living in the aftermath of really flawed data, outdated data as well. Can you talk to the topic of the violence of normality a little bit more?
Yeah, and I think Francis Galton is a good person to bring in a bit further here, because he did a huge amount of work on statistics and other areas of science in the late 19th century. He was Charles Darwin's younger cousin. But as I mentioned, he also coined the term eugenics. So he came up with this idea of what he saw as a race science, that the human population could be improved by encouraging those people who he thought were most fit to have more children, and preventing those people who he thought were least fit from having children. Well, Galton himself emphasized positive eugenics more, so he thought that people like him and his wealthy friends should be having more children. There are, of course, incredible violence and harm done through the lens of eugenics through the late 19th and into the 20th century.
Forced
Through
sterilizations and
murders, sterilizations, incarceration as well. So often in England, people like to say, oh well, we didn't have the sterilization laws that American and a lot of European countries had, which continued incredibly late in the Czech Republic. I think the last sterilizations of Romani women were happening in the early 2000s. So some of these practices continued far longer than we might imagine. But in the UK, we also had things like the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913, which led to the incarceration of large numbers of people for this new category of so-called mental deficiency, which was very poorly defined and included such things as a woman who had a child with no means of financial support. So unmarried mothers might be more likely to be deemed mentally defective, as they termed them at the time, than a working man, say, through no fault of her own. So it really affected the poorer populations. It often affected women more than men, especially in the colonial endeavour, but also in Western countries as well, affected Black populations specifically harshly.
And so when you see the rollout of this under the guise of the concept of normality and looking to maintain normality or achieve normality, it's this term that really, I guess in some ways, serves to naturalize a political agenda to favor the in-group and really discriminate against the out-group.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes people have wanted to kind of to try and separate the two things, like you used to. I think it happens far less now. But of course, see things like famous scientists' names recognized in the namings of buildings, or their work recognized in an exhibition, for example, without any acknowledgement of this undercurrent. So you might see some of Francis Galton's work on, say, fingerprinting techniques without any acknowledgement of his role in the idea of eugenics. And yet for Galton, these two things were completely interlinked. So his interest in statistics, his interest in the normal and the normal distribution. He coined the term normal distribution for the bell curve. These things were all completely bound up together for him. So I think it's incorrect of us to try and separate them out today and say, oh, well, he did this thing that was good, so we'll pretend he didn't have these other ideas as well.
And then didn't Carl Pearson then pick up Francis Galton's work and just ran it with it even further?
Yes. So Pearson, as Galton's protege at UCL, and I think he was the first Galton professor of eugenics, or chair of eugenics. I can't remember the exact title. And he continued the eugenics laboratory that was founded there, and continued to work in that vein. And again, there's I think we need to acknowledge that this history is complicated, and that these scientists are not necessarily divided into good and progressive people and bad and not progressive people, because Pearson's an interesting one in that he was involved in a number of feminist and socialist groups in his youth. He perhaps didn't have the reactionary ideas that we expect that people, or imagine today, that people in promoting ideas like eugenics must have had. And yeah, so these kind of differing views can coexist together, whereas today we like to think of perhaps as this is bad and reactionary and regressive, and in the past, and this is a progressive, but those two things aren't neatly separated.
That's interesting, because we, after the Nuremberg trials in the Second World War, when the actions of the Nazi movement were vilified, and quite rightly vilified, it was all about pointing our finger at, oh, those naughty people over there who did this, and look at everything they did, it's really bad. And then quickly, while they were pointing their finger at the Germans, they were quickly cleaning up their own backyard, because some of the things that people were doing in the US, the UK, and Australia even were very similar, harsh eugenic practices. And in some ways, I look at cultural practices today, and you look at the Nazi movement choirs, or you look at the Nazi methods of murder and annihilation. And I feel like we have replaced the methods of murder and annihilation with the positive drivers of consumerism and standardization, and pursuing consumerist ideals. And when I look at Zumba classes, or aerobics classes, and everyone's standing in line and following the actions of the person up the front, they're not that much different from the Nazi movement choirs, where everyone was copying the movement of a choreographer up the front who was showing them all the aerobic moves to copy in order to obtain the perfect Aryan body. I feel like the pursuit of normality is very much still alive with us. What observations do you have about the importance of debunking this concept for a contemporary audience?
A big question. I think sometimes these things are so embedded in our lives that we don't even notice they're there. One of the things I often talk with my friends about that is standardized clothing, because we're so used to standard clothing sizes, just getting off the shelf clothes, that we don't even think about how that alters how we think about our bodies. So when even well into the 20th century, most people were making their own clothes or having them made for them if they were wealthier. So their clothes were made to fit them, rather than the other way around, them trying to fit their clothes. And in fact, one of the sets of data from the Norma statue was for an attempt to develop standardized clothing sizes for American women, and that study really struggled to come up with a guide as to how these clothes could be made, because they said that the average woman was of limited usefulness. Women didn't fit into neat categories, that the ratios between their measurements varied considerably, so made it well nigh impossible to create standardized sizes. And even when these early ideas came in, there was a notion that at each size you would have 3 kind of different body shapes or body types, but that was obviously financially complicated for any provider to create such a wide array of different sizes. So in the second half of the 20th century, these off-the-peg clothing became widespread, and now myself and my friends that I've spoken to, I think when we were growing up, we never really considered that actually we always assumed our bodies were at fault for not fitting into clothes, rather than the other way around. So these things are so pervasive, and we grow up with this idea that we need to fit into what's around us, that it's sometimes very hard to question.
This benign looking objective concept of normality has actually got massive biological consequences, because we're trying to sculpt our bodies to fit in, as opposed to creating environments that are inclusive, where we have a sense of belonging. It sounds, yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir when it comes to me, because I'm a very sympathetic audience. But what I loved about your book is that it's highly readable. It's really accessible. It was read to me on Audible by Stephanie Racine, who does a wonderful job of reading it. And there's so many avenues to this historical study of the concept of normality that are very contemporary, that are very relevant to contemporary audiences. And I really urge people to read the book. But now, you do point out that asking what is normal might not be the right question. So what questions do you think we should ask about normality?
I think we should ask what we mean by it. I think we should be more aware of it in our conversation and think about the work that it's doing each time. What are we actually asking when we ask whether we are normal, or whether a certain thing is normal? And we should very much think about, who does that leave out? Who is it that we're comparing ourselves to when we ask whether we're normal, and who are we excluding from this idea?
Sarah Chaney, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you on Idioms of Normality today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Paul.
And Idioms of Normality is part of the Future Framed TV series hosted by Traces&Dreams. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Paul Mason, and it's always a pleasure to speak with people and ask them the question, what is normal?